Thanks, Jonathan, for presenting. That was amazing to see. Also to share like the work from other projects you've been working on and all of your courses that you've been teaching.
Yeah, thank you. So now we'd like to open the floor to the audience for any questions they have for our speakers, or even cross-speaker questions if there are any.
Well, first I want to say thanks for for organizing this, Winston and Vincent. This is it's great to hear these kind of symposiums, and especially when it's relating to ethics and design. I think there's definite need for that. So thanks for putting that together. It's really it was really nice to hear everyone talk and see these three different very specific perspectives. I have a question for Theodora. I just want to say first, I was really fascinated by the statement about the fact that explicating design methods, or I guess having a more rational understanding of design could be maybe beneficial to users, but not so much when designers are applying design in such a, I guess, explicit, or not explicit, but rational way. And I guess relating to that, I guess I have a controversial opinion. And I was wondering if I could get your take on this, and maybe Jonathan too, since your presentation talked about the removal of architects from the general public, or from the general, I guess, multidisciplinary exchange. And so my opinion is that the complexity of design as a multidisciplinary field, and the pervasive use of poetics in design kind of those kind of tend to make articulation difficult for architects with other disciplines. Or we're not really, I guess my opinion is that we're not really as good, or maybe it's just me in this position, but not really as good at communicating technical or very specific measurable aspects of design to clients or engineers or other professionals whose job it is to really focus on one very particular aspect of design. And I guess I was wondering if any of you agree with that statement, or and also like is there anything that is there any way that design thinking or design methods could be more democratic and I guess more than just a tool for explicating design, but also going beyond and being a useful rhetoric tool beyond just always using, I guess, reference to the imagination or the creative aspect of design for convincing projects. I don't know if that was clear.
Yeah, no, it's very clear. Thank you for this question. I think it's very interesting, and definitely what you're describing was one of the kind of key anxieties that historically kind of motivated the adoption of design methods in architecture. So, I mean, Yona Friedman, for instance, speaks very specifically in his book about this kind of transition from architecture as something that's apprenticeable, that you learn as an apprentice, to something that's teachable and can be kind of communicated like almost in textbooks. So there was like another example is John Christopher Jones, who was one of the kind of design methods founding figures. He was talking about kind of like really taking design and almost dissecting it, like opening it up, like going beyond the kind of black box. So there was definitely a kind of desire to make things more transparent. And this idea of making things more transparent, making them kind of teachable, but also making them justifiable, making decisions justifiable, like in a way I think is easily tied to some ideas, to some kind of like ethical, moral kind of ideas, you know, about the kind of legitimacy of our decisions and what we do as a profession. So in a way there were these two kind of caricatures that were produced. Like one was the kind of artistic genius that just does things just because, and they have no way of explaining that. And definitely, like in the 60s, there was a frustration with that figure, and a kind of idea that we need to kind of move beyond that. The other kind of extreme would be like really architecture as a knowledge that's explicit, as you were saying, you know, that you can kind of remove the tacit, like inexplainable kind of dimensions. And definitely around that time, there was a kind of fascination with informational approaches to design. So like really understanding design as a process of information processing. So which have kind of like stayed, I think, as metaphors in a way, in the way that we think about kind of participation today as well. I mean, I don't know, like I think my interest is more in kind of understanding these debates, like understanding where the one figure versus the other figure kind of like, you know, in what context are they kind of validated as models for kind of a professional architect. I definitely think that, I mean, that's just my opinion, that there's parts of design that, you know, that it is a knowledge pursuit, like that there can be architectural knowledge that can be kind of studied and understood, and design methods and design research today is trying to do that. But I think they've done a really good job of moving beyond you know, the sort of mathematical, techno-rational kind of approach as the only kind of like valid way of approaching that, of like really gaining that knowledge. So today there's a lot of things like, you know, there's definitely a kind of idea that there's a lot of tacit dimensions, that, you know, the idea of kind of a seamless informational translation in all stages of design is not possible. That sometimes, you know, just kind of like listening to someone and empathizing is better than trying to kind of make sure that, you know, information has not been distorted in the process. I don't know if I answered your question, but I think maybe to your first, I do think that it's important to clarify a little bit these two figures of the designer, and understand that the idea of explication and really making design process transparent, that it's really tied to things like what's design and architecture's position in like research universities, for instance, you know, like in relation to other disciplines that were seen as more kind of valid in the 60s. Or it even has to do with architecture as a service profession, you know, that we start seeing ourselves as service professionals as opposed to kind of like artists. So yeah, I'm not exactly answering it, but I think it's important to understand how tangled up these stereotypes are, I think, both with historical conditions, but also with kind of broader ideas about what the profession is and what it's supposed to do and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
I mean, the only thing I can say, Simon, is, I mean, I hear you on the question as well, that you're asking the question, how do we talk about the squishy decisions that are made in architecture? And I think one thing I've learned from being in a workplace that wants to ask about these squishy decisions is that I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that we don't want architecture to be tacit or implicit or make those squishy decisions. That actually, when I do think that talking to people more about what you're doing and having a framework to do that might actually offer you the insight that people want you to do more of it, or that they just want you to do a different type. And so I think it's, I mean, I think of this stuff in terms of storytelling. I think that I've thoroughly, in trying to like become more of an objective designer, I've actually found that people really love the subjective side, ironically, and that it's just a question of how do you, yeah, maybe it is moral on my side, maybe there's an honesty part, but there's just an ability to, how do I clearly tell my story and what this is about, and how do I figure out if that's what people want? And when I see failures in architecture, I think sometimes it's about not giving someone, you know, realizing that the story you're telling with this architecture is different, and that maybe one side wants it and the other side doesn't want it. But I think there's definitely an alignment on wanting a story. So I think there's definitely some exciting I think this process of discussion and the frameworks in which these discussions happen that can be used to kind of align stories are really important.
I really appreciated the presentation for, I think all three of the presenters gave us an understanding of, I guess, how we can use tools as a way of democratizing designs. And I think that puts an increased emphasis on us as designers as, I guess, asking the right questions. I'm wondering if maybe each of the presenters can give examples of maybe questions that are often missed, or the important questions that we need to ask moving forward to, I guess, give the right voice to the right people.
Yeah, I don't know. I can start. I'm going to start badly. So I can just tell a story. I think that before moving down south, where we had more robust, this company I worked for had very robust processes in which they would undergo a human-centered design project. And those are what I learned. Before moving there, I think I underrated the importance of figuring out who you talk to and who your audience is, and where you get your information. And I think we're just at the very beginning of this discussion in architecture. Like, we just have to win everyone over and say, yes, it actually is important to talk to people first. That's kind of step one. I think once we get that, I mean, there's really, really important discussions about who do you talk to and how representative is that population. And I think that, I think we'll probably keep having extremely important problems as we more and more involve ourselves in maybe a more human-centered design process. But I think one really important problem that I think speaks to your question is that identifying, finding a way of saying who you want to talk to is really important, and justifying that is also, and then doing it sensitively so that you get a range of representation and a balance of opinions is a really important thing. So I think an eye on what am I, how broad is my input set is a really important thing.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna say something that might sound a bit perverse or kind of controversial. You know, I guess like my answer would be that I think it's important to, like, for me, it's extremely important to really focus on how. That's why I talk about kind of techniques. I absolutely think that the agenda of giving people a voice and involving them in the design process is extremely valuable. I think there's no question about that. But, you know, very often it's sort of hijacked by techniques that in a way do that in a very limited way. I guess like my talk was trying to kind of get to that there's a particular imagination of design that's projected on what these people can do or say, or how their information is translated into kind of a design project. I guess the perverse idea would be that, I don't know, I forget where I was reading that. It's not only me who thinks that, but I think the fundamental anxiety here is that there's the kind of context of design, as Jonathan was saying. You're removed from the context of use very often. And like very often there's kind of a question of how do we bridge the two. But I think there are perspectives that say that the context of use is already like extremely creative in its own right, you know, and that people do just by kind of inhabiting their spaces, you know, that they go far beyond the things that we've sort of like expected that they would do, you know, that inhabitation is a creative act. I know that this all sounds a bit kind of just more on the poetic side, but just, you know, that the fact that you're dwelling in a space is already kind of a creative act. And, you know, like some critics would say that designers trying to kind of, they're trying to kind of colonize the context of use through these methods. You know, they're trying to anticipate like every possible way that someone would reconfigure something, or like they're trying to kind of define the extent of possibility and make sure that if people end up changing things, it will fall within the 50 cases that you've sort of like laid out from the beginning. So that's a bit cynical, but I think still, I I don't know, I think that Jonathan has spoken to that a lot. I think that there's a question of like understanding use and understanding users that might really indirectly kind of inform design without us having this kind of desire to always sort of unproblematically bridge what we're designing with how it's going to be used, or kind of following this modernist idea that we need to design for perfect fit. So I think it's more kind of a moral position that it's very important to imagine, to have the context of use in our design decisions, but without having any illusions that we'll be able to ever completely predict every possible case, or like really limit the limit possibilities, which in a way I think is one of the problems that have been tainting participatory, more systematic approaches.
Build on that a little bit. I think that one of the most important things we can do to try and connect those voices that aren't often heard is in those cases, if we have a limited set of goals, is we leverage the dog's awake. I swear I just let her out. So hopefully we'll be okay with a little bit of barking in the background. So I think that we can leverage the curb cut effect, which is that those curb cuts that allow people in wheelchairs, for example, to get up onto the curb on the sidewalk. I mean, those were originally designed for people in wheelchairs or with mobility issues, but now they're used by, like, it's advantageous to everyone, right? And I'm not sure this is something that's common in architecture to be taught, but it's one of the first things you learn when you start talking about accessibility. You know, it's someone with a bike now uses it. If you're walking, if you have use of your legs, you can use it more easily than stepping up onto a curb. You're not going to stub your foot. If you have a small dog, they can just kind of walk on up. So the idea that you build more accessible or universal designs means that it's better designed for everyone. And so seeding your use cases with those sort of more challenging points, or those designs that really capture what might previously have been our edge cases, and centering those voices and those people can help us support everyone better. And so I think that if we really try to have a varied set of different use cases that are representative or even more challenging, that way we can create better designs in general that then can handle those use cases. How we do that, I think, is another challenge. I think asking that question is a good starting point. Like, just thinking about, well, how can we address this? How do we include people that we're maybe not considering in this? You know, can we consider other people? That's one thing. I think the other thing is to just formally and informally connect with as many different people as possible. When we were designing Dual Panto, for example, I mean, this was for a specific population of people who are blind and visually impaired. We would have sort of friends of the lab, people who would come in who were blind and visually impaired or part of that community and connect with that community. And they would, you know, every couple of months, they just come in and feel what we're working on and talk with us. And there were people that understood design. There are people that maybe wouldn't call themselves necessarily a designer, but they're very good at articulating their needs, and they're giving a critique, an honest critique. And so having that informal rapport or connection with people can really help you realize things that you maybe had been assuming when you're not from that population that you're trying to design for. And we found that super, super valuable. Same thing for I'm supervising a couple capstone projects. And so this is more engineering versus architecture. And I don't know if we want to debate whether there's some, you know, whether the design or problem solving process is different between the subfields, but you know, you really come, like, if you're an engineer, you want to solve a problem. And so you try and characterize it, and you use the hammers and the tools that you know to try and solve it. But really, I've been just encouraging my teams to go out and connect with the different communities. So one team is working with the deaf and hard of hearing community. And so, you know, one of them is learning American Sign Language, and that's been really, really useful. And then just connecting with people online. And it's kind of weird because you don't want to appear to come from a point of privilege and try and solve someone else's problems. That's not reasonable. But also you are, you know, if you're an architect or if you're an engineer, you have a certain set of training that you can then maybe help out. And so you want to get that connection and that back and forth to be able to work with them. And so in this idea of, are people, is everyone a designer versus are there people that I definitely wouldn't say there are people that are, creative geniuses and they just suddenly like, that's what design is. I do think design can be taught. But, if you are trained in design, like for the hapticians that I gave, the example that I gave, the expert hapticians know the process and they can apply it. Novices were not able to do that. If you know the process, you can lend that expertise to the domain knowledge or the lived experience someone else can provide and work together in a way that is complementary. I hope that I address the question Bill and everyone with the barking. I kind of missed one or two of the key words, so I'll hand it off for now.
Sure. And we have another question from Emma Mosley in the chat. And she says, Oliver, do you know of or foresee any examples of haptic technologies being used in architecture? I've seen some in amusement park projects, but would be interested in perhaps lower tech applications, such as playgrounds or public fountains. What can we learn from haptic design processes to create better buildings? Thanks for the presentation.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the question, and I'm glad you like the presentation. I think, so there's maybe a couple ways I could see haptics being used with architecture. One of the most obvious ways might be it could be used in the design process. So if you have tangibles or constructs that you're moving around, if it's haptic, you might be able to change, either it could be shape changing tangibles that you move around. And so you can kind of say, well, if the building's a bit bigger, and you could feel around, or you could feel different textures and say, yes, this texture, this feels way better than this other one. Let's have that on the door, on the handle, or on the banisters, or what have you. So you would be able to kind of get that sense of touch before, more rapidly, without needing to source a bunch of different materials. You kind of scout them out, or maybe you can work tangibly with different components, or when planning a layout. I don't know architecture very well, so I hope I'm getting the activities right. But imagine that having that sense of touch would be very useful in that process. When actually deploying it in like a building or an environment, that becomes a little more challenging, partially because haptics needs to be very, very polished to be effective. You really have to have the right hardware combined with the right software and put in the right spot at the right time. Like case in point, the Taptic engine by Apple, they developed this excellent hardware. It's a really nice actuator. And then they had a couple fiber tactile sensations when it first came out. And then they really didn't get a wide variety of expressive sensations, or release an API. They didn't release the API until I think last summer, because it took so long trying to get that quality assurance right to make sure it was consistent across the different devices. They had to spend all of that time polishing. Now, Apple spends a lot of time polishing in general, but it's really, really challenging, and they have control over the hardware. They can kind of control everything in this device, and it's not subject to how people change an environment in a building, which I imagine would be much more challenging. So the level of polish is going to be really, really challenging. Power requirements are going to be really challenging. If you have any sort of force or any sort of large display or anything, it's going to take up a lot of power. And I think sensors are usually a lot easier to integrate than actuators. And so one thing I'm interested in is, can you get information of, Internet of Things? With the Internet of Things, a lot of it's been sensing. A lot of it's, you put cameras, you put little infrared sensors all over the place. Can you deploy an actuator that would move or react to you? And I think that that's a lot more challenging just because of the power requirements. That being said, yeah, and so I think the question of fidelity, if you're going lower tech, is challenging. And I think the question of cost and consistency and context is going to be really, really challenging. But I'm excited to see that. I think that at some point that will happen, and I think it'll be really cool. Where you can maybe do it now is on touch screens, like a kiosk. There are different kinds of actuators right now that let you program texture into touch screens or have mid-air effects. And so where you have like little kiosks or terminals, then you could start to incorporate some of this stuff. But I think it's gonna be a while until you get more interesting, changing haptic feedback in the wild. But I'd be curious to hear what Jonathan or Theodora have to say to that.
I haven't seen much of it in the wild either. And I think I'm curious about how haptics, I mean, maybe I see haptics as part of a parallel design industry that is looking at how novices can do really complex stuff, and how haptics can help them do that. And I'm just thinking about, sorry, I'll rewind that question just a little bit. I'm just thinking about some of the research I've been doing about you know, proposing these technologies that engage users more and actually ask them to do more work. The common feedback that I heard was that actually it's very difficult to make people want to do more stuff. Even the Murphy bed can be a failure. You have this great idea that you can save some space, but people hate tucking their bed sheets in and putting away the Murphy bed. So, you know, you've got all these great ideas that are like Walter Siegel's that people will go out and be very encouraged because you've got a smooth system that can click together. But there's a lot of resistance to the difficulty of these things. And where I see, you know, where I wonder about haptics is where we have very difficult things that we're proposing. And I think one of the most difficult areas of architecture is the construction phase. So I think of people with vests. I've heard about projects where construction actually is starting to happen on remote. So perhaps control happens in one place. And I think it's very sci-fi at this point, but I do wonder, as sci-fi turns into actually how we maybe, you know, maybe things are made this way, it may more and more start to entertain the need to use total non-users like mom and dad in, I don't know, getting something to dig a hole in the backyard. So I do wonder about the construction phase and where haptics might have a role there, and maybe does already.
No, but I think something that Oliver said, which was I found really interesting, was this idea that it can be used either in the context of like a kind of pedagogical context, you know, like in model making. Like it seems that like early design education has a lot to do with kind of like, well, especially more and more with kind of manipulating things and understanding, kind of extrapolating little models into kind of bigger space and developing this kind of relationship between things that you sort of manipulate and your kind of spatial imagination. So I think definitely this idea of having some kind of haptic feedback while you're kind of manipulating material, I think that's really, really interesting. And then, you know, in actual spaces, I think there's a lot of kind of speculative projects that are trying to kind of use touch to imagine kind of spatial overlays, you know, like imagine moving in a space and then suddenly feeling invisible obstacles that kind of remind you of something that existed there before, but you cannot really see. But I think just broadly, because there's all this criticism that architecture has been really kind of centered on the eye, like both in the way that it's represented, made, and then kind of understood as a use. I think there's just exploding possibilities in terms of imagining how touch can be kind of recentered as a way of thinking about design creatively.
I'm happy to like just respond very quickly to a couple of those points. I think, yeah, I think in education and in sort of motion guidance or constraints to help guide people through processes, these are classic applications of haptics. They're well understood when you have the actuator or if you have like a robot arm to manipulate. Where it's challenging is how do you get a robot arm in everyone's home to construct the Murphy, like to construct the Murphy bed or to construct a piece of furniture. There are some interesting ways that you could like, you know, actuate muscles to guide people through that process, but it's quite forward looking. It's not going to be in the immediate future. Pedagogically, I think that's something that's quite common is motor training and possibly education of like the project I shared with Force Feedback was about learning STEM topics and using the sense of touch or embodied learning to be able to learn about abstract concepts is very common, but also a very challenging field. Education is not an easy field to research in. So yeah, I think there's lots of potential there, but a lot of it might be far out to being used in some of the cases that we would want it to be seen at scale.
So we have a couple more questions, and I think that's about all the time that we have for questions to be mindful of people's time, and we hope to wrap up around 4. So next up for questions is Purna.
Hi. I have like a general question about so with like the idea of democratizing design, I often feel like the methods used become very engineer-like and completely solution-driven, rather than what I imagine the role of an architect could be. And I just wanted some comments on that like relationship between democratizing design and then also like what an architect can do.
Yes, maybe I could start by saying something very quick on that. I do think that a kind of awareness of the historical trajectories in which current rhetoric of democratization, from which it has emerged, is important because in a way, like very often we sort of like look back to the 60s for precedents because there was a big kind of participatory turn around the end of the 60s. But I think it's important to understand that the way that participation or democratization was framed at the time was very much kind of like in a high modernism, not high modernism in the sense of formalism, but I think kind of, you know, like mass industrial production and how can we take these kind of industrialized components that we're making and recombine them in different ways. How can we, yeah, like the culture around design was very much kind of like tied up with a problem-solving mentality, as you're kind of pointing out. So, I mean, I'm just going to say a very quick thing that I think it's important to always be aware that rhetoric and claims that we make, or like the way that we understand certain concepts, are constructed through these historical lineages. And I think finding kind of critical opportunities there is important. You know, as you're saying, how can people participate more in problem setting as opposed to problem solving? Are there parts of the architectural tradition that we've sort of like rejected because we saw them as tied to this idea of the creative genius? You know, are there parts of that that could be reclaimed in our participatory processes now? Do we have to do away with drawing? I think there's like a lot of questions that are often kind of taken for granted in the way that we're understanding the concept, as you're pointing out. That I feel that historical awareness of how that concept was constructing could allow us to kind of debate and question and rethink. So I guess I'm just making a call for kind of critical history as opposed to a kind of nostalgia for kind of ideas that were born at that time and that were never kind of realized in our field.
Do you have a recommendation for someone to like read from or like more just to like be able to learn more about that?
You mean the histories of participatory of democratization?
Yeah.
There's a few good chapters in a book called The Second Modernism, which is an edited volume that looks at several projects that were done at MIT in the 60s, and some of them look at histories of self-build and self-design, and they're trying to kind of understand specifically how these ideas were kind of discussed at the time. There's also, yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I wasn't gonna do the shameless self-promotion, but I've written a few things on that and I'm trying to now write a book on that. But other than that, there's also some really good historical books on the idea of the user by Kenny Coopers and some other people. I mean, if you want to email me, I can send you a bibliography, but how the idea of the user and the creative user was kind of constructed in post-war France and things like that. So I can definitely put something together and send it to you. If you want.
Cool. I will definitely email then. Thank you.
Great.
So we have our last question for today. Karam writes, Professor Theodore Varduli, you talk about how a graph can define a number of connected spaces in a floor plan mathematically. I'm curious, what kind of architectural information can be fed into a graph to define architectural relationships? Is it simply the geometry of the space, or are there other factors that influence how spaces are mapped?
Yeah, so I mean, again, I think there's many new kind of applications right now. There was like a lot of new applications also with machine learning and things like that. I mean, it was interesting. I think many of you guys must have seen this Harvard thesis that was using kind of an adversarial neural net to create Manhattan floor plans. I don't know, it was really popular. Like everyone was kind of like knowing it and looking at it by a student. Anyway, so now they've published another very recent article, I think in data science or something, toward data science, which is called Architecture as a Graph. So this idea of thinking about architecture as a graph is kind of continuing today, and people are doing kind of work with it. But I think like the work that I was kind of describing was not extremely diverse. You know, there were like pretty much kind of two approaches. So one was this idea of creating an adjacency graph, which was that you just, let's say you have 5 rooms, you represent those rooms as points, and then you just draw all the possible lines between them, like all the combinations, to figure out what are all the different ways in which these rooms can be connected. So there was one exercise of just trying to figure out what are the, like all the possible ways in which like a number of rooms can be connected. And then they had all these methods which are more complicated, but again, I'm happy to answer through an email, using kind of Kirchhoff's laws and like certain laws for kind of then taking those abstract configurations and giving them dimensions, like figuring out if they would fit within a specific footprint of a building or something. And then like a big other kind of type of work was trying to figure out how these spatial patterns can correspond to certain patterns of human activities. So like, for instance, if a nurse is moving around like an operating room, every time she stops at a point, you put a dot there and then you count how many times, you know, they've followed a certain path. So you create kind of like a graph of the movement, and then try to see for that particular activity pattern, how do different spatial patterns kind of score in terms of their effectiveness, kind of. So, I mean, I guess like the broad way would be that, yeah, you would represent human activities, but activity was seen as tasks in specific points in space, right? So, or you would represent several kind of topological or then dimensional aspects of like a floor plan. But, you know, there's so much, you know, graphs are pervasive in computer science. Obviously, it's not, I think now it's become like a representation that in a way is naturalized, like when you try to solve kind of these problems computationally. So yeah, there's a lot of current literature as well that looks at other applications.
Right, so I think I think we all want to say a big thank you to all of our guests who took the time to talk to all of us about their work and their involvement in the design community. And as well as to thank all of our audience members for their attendance and wonderful questions. I believe that the importance of democratizing design can be further normalized in our design methodology and workflow. And I think it's great that we're able to have this productive discussion and conversation about these topics today. So I'll leave you with a quote from Yona Friedman. An architect does not create a city, only an accumulation of objects. It's the inhabitants who invents the city. An uninhabited city, even if new, is only a ruin. So that's it for today. Hopefully everyone was able to get something out of this symposium. So up next in the lineup of symposiums for the spring is Columns and Capitals on July 14th. This will be hosted by Wayne Yan, Alice Huang, and Levi Van Reerden. So hope to see all of you there, and thank you all for participating.
Thank you guys so much.